Welcome to Snippets of Wisdom with your host, Mike Carell and Dr. Michael J. Murphy. Snippets of Wisdom is the boomer's gift to the next generation and to the world at large. Dr. Michael J. Murphy and Coach Mike Carell are experienced psychotherapists, writers, and healers who find the greatest satisfaction in sharing the benefits of a lifetime of struggle and learning. Coach Mike has spent decades spreading deep wisdom and supporting youth through the juvenile justice system. Dr. Michael has directed mental health services at many correctional centers and testified in countless trials as an expert in sex-related issues and mental illness. And he was one of the 500,000 humans at Woodstock. So now, please welcome the hosts of Snippets of Wisdom.
And welcome to Snippets of Wisdom. I'm Coach Mike Carell. Today we're going to traverse the tangled terrain of sex and touch in a contemporary society, exploring it as a commodity, as a legal minefield, and perhaps most radically, as a conduit to healing. Dr. Murphy?
One of the things that I think we'll have the opportunity to focus on is the tremendous variety of circumstances that relate to this issue that we call sex. What is sex? I mean, how do we define this thing we call sex? I mean, even though it's simply a word that we use very frequently, it really is something that is subject to many different interpretations and many different influences in the legal setting, in the clinical setting, in treatment settings. So I have a history of working for an extended period of time in facilities that specifically address sexually related issues, sexually related disorders, and their manifestations in terms of behavior. So that's something that we'll be talking about and exploring over the course of this presentation.
We're also going to be referencing thinkers like Ashley Montagu, whose work touching the human significance of skin underscores the primal importance of physical connection. We'll also talk about Dr. Thomas LaCour, who wrote a book called Making Sex, and that traces the shifting boundaries of sex and gender from the Greeks to Freud. We'll also examine how the erotic has been wielded as a power, as Andre Lorde beautifully theorized, and consider the psychological impact of objectification and trauma, referencing Fredrickson, Roberts, as well as Judith Herman.
One of the interesting complexities of this issue, I think, is the difference between sexual identity and sexual interest. You know, when we talk about, for example, what is sex? I mean, does that relate to gender identity, how we choose to identify ourselves in terms of our gender identity, or is it the actual motivation towards sexual contact that we experience ourselves? Is it the actual act of sexual contact? Is that what we mean by sex? And so there's many different ways that the word is used, many references that it has, and I think we need to address them all. And it's extremely powerful now in today's society as we are opening up, I think, to a significant degree in terms of our willingness to discuss these issues, make hard decisions about how we want to manage sexual interests and motivations and behavior. And so in order to do that, we need to have these conversations. And we look forward to having these hard conversations here on Snippets of Wisdom in the coming weeks and months.
Absolutely. You know, there are so many issues that are aligned with the commodification and the criminalization of sex and the marketing of sex. You know, in the recent years, the confusion about gender and sexual orientation has become more pronounced among some people. You know, it's interesting to note how some people will automatically jump to conclusions when they hear labels like gender preference or orientation or, you know, non-binary or gay or homo or, you know, whatever it is. there's so much to consider because what used to be standard dichotomous labels have now um, emerged as multiple layers, multiple labels. And by the way, we tend to use labels for convenience, out of convenience, without realizing that sometimes the label that we're putting on somebody is not inappropriate, does not fit the person at all. And yet, because for us it's a convenient label, uh, we attach it and we begin to consider that person um, as described by the label. Big no-no. One of the things that will help us sort through all of this is taking a look at each of the different layers that we have. And we'd like to begin with the commodification of sex. Fiona Atwood, in a book called Sexed Up, um, she says that sexualization permeates our culture, obviously, through advertising and media, turning desire into a marketable product. Yet, while sex is everywhere, genuine, healthy touch is scarce. Ashley Montagu's research on skin hunger, it's our innate need for touch. It suggests that its deprivation is both widespread and damaging.
One of the things that we talk about, I think, and need to talk about, and that she was raising up, that is Ashley Montague, when her book Touching, the Human Significance of the Skin was originally published way back in 1971, is that the process of touch actually is another sense. We talk about the sense of smell, the sense of hearing, the sense of vision, all these things. But touch is essentially another sense that we have as human beings that really needs to be addressed and cared for, just like any other sense of communication that we have. I mean, touch is how we communicate with each other. But, it seems like this particular sense, even more than other senses, has become a source of complication legally, personally, and interactively, so that we really have, lots of passionate feelings about it, understandably. And when we think of boundaries, oftentimes we're thinking about sensory boundaries. I mean, wanting to set boundaries with regard to ourselves as to how we are actually touched and the nature of the contact that we allow ourselves to engage in. So I think this is a huge issue in terms of our society now and our need for touch. One of the things, at the beginning when we think about sex is that sex is obviously the fundamental primal drive toward procreation that humanity must engage in order to create and perpetuate the human species.
Yeah,
So we need to address this impulse and this drive in a way that literally allows us to survive, while at the same time managing this drive in a way that ensures the safety of others, the respect of others, the accurate interpretation of others. And in these days, it's even more complex, and we've allowed ourselves to really finally examine these issues in a much more subtle and diverse, if you will, manner.
true. One of the things that brings some confusion and with a lot of people and some of the discomfort that people experience when it comes to experiencing touch and sex. Well, one thing is that the idea that sex was only for procreation sends some people into a furtive attitude or furtive posture when it comes to engaging in sex with somebody else. The truth is, sex has more than one purpose. Yes, it is primarily for reproduction. And yet today, sex is used as entertainment. It's used as a way of expression. It's used as a way of actually healing people emotionally in many different domains. So, if we could get past the idea that sex has only one person, I think we could begin to take a look at one purpose. I mean, we could begin to take a look at how helpful it is to know what sex is for and how we appropriate it in our lives.
One of the things that I think it's interesting to raise up that many people have heard about is a study in Romania, the country of Romania, many years ago, in which children were held in a facility in which they were not allowed to have any contact with other human beings for extended period of time over the course of their early life and infancy and childhood. And that was an opportunity, sadly, to evaluate what the effect of lack of touch on developing human beings actually was. And in fact, what happened is that it was discovered as a result of that situation that children and people who are deprived of the opportunity to experience touch experience severe developmental delays and impairments with regard to their ability to evolve as human beings. So touch is not only something that we either need to manage in this way or that way, but it's something that we really require as human beings. And that's the issue that Ashley Montague is really trying to address most thoroughly in her book on touching, is that the need to be touched is really a normal human need that just has to be addressed in order for us to evolve and really develop as human beings. So how
Right.
do we do that though? How do we set boundaries that are appropriate with regard to how we are touched and when we are touched and in what circumstances we are touched, at the same time as we address the fact that um, that we require touch in order to be healthy? You
Yeah.
know, it's interesting because you can almost compare it to food and diet. You know, we can eat food that is not good for us, but we require food in order to survive. You know,
Right.
so sometimes we end up eating food that is not particularly conducive to our well-being because, you know, we need it. We need some of it. But the choices that we make about the quality of our diet. Similarly, we can think about with regard to human contact, how we allow ourselves to be touched and how we
Absolutely.
choose to touch others. We
Yeah.
need to make these constant decisions about to maintain our health. And just to ignore it or just touch in any random way that happens to manifest itself is not particularly good for us.
For
So,
sure.
so we really need to prioritize the conversation about touch. You know, so couples, families, individuals, colleagues, workers, you know, how do we manage this whole decision about human contact and the touching that we have? Uh, Being able to talk about that in a way that is open uh, and caring and suggestive of alternatives that would meet the needs that we have to have in order to satisfy the requirement that we must be touched as human beings if we are to be healthy. So if you get the chance, I'll have the opportunity to read a touching poem, literally, if you'll excuse the pun, you know, at the end of this meeting. That's really a beautiful poem about a person who is now older, as many of us are now, including myself. And you know, how much does aging affect our need to be touched or the opportunity to be touched?
It's a good
And
point.
yeah, how much does that contribute to our health and well-being? So these are all issues that are really predominant now, and I think they're complex and subtle. And you know, fortunately, in our society, we're starting to talk about them, and I think that's a really good thing.
It is. We're going to be talking more about some of the ramifications of this introduction when we come back. So don't go away, come back, and we'll talk some more.
Mike Zorich, a three-time California state champion in Greco-Roman wrestling at 114 pounds. Mike, blind since birth, was born in Hartford, Connecticut. He was a 6-time national placer, including 2 seconds, 2 thirds, and 2 fourths. He also won the Veterans Folk Style Wrestling twice at 152 pounds. In all these tournaments, he was the only blind competitor. Nancy Zorick, a creative spirit whose talents have taken her to the stage and into galleries and exhibitions in several states. Her father, a commercial artist who shared his instruments with his daughter and helped her fine-tune her natural abilities, influenced her decision to follow in his footsteps. Ms. Zorick has enjoyed a fruitful career doing what she loves. Listen Saturday mornings at 12 Eastern for the Nancy and Mike Show for heartwarming stories and interesting talk.
Are you struggling to care for elderly parents or a spouse? Do you wonder if being a caregiver is making you sick? Are you worried about taking time off work to care for elderly parents and balance work, life, and caregiving? Has caregiving become exhausting and emotionally draining? Are you an aging adult who wants to remain independent, but you're not sure how? I'm Pamela D. Wilson. Join me for the Caring Generation radio show for caregivers and aging adults, Wednesday evenings, 6 Pacific, 7 Mountain, 8 Central, and 9 Eastern, where I answer these questions and share tips for managing stress, family relationships, health, well-being, and more. Podcasts and transcripts of The Caring Generation are on my website, PamelaDWilson.com, plus my caregiving library, online caregiver support programs, and programs for corporations interested in supporting working caregivers. Help, hope, and support for caregivers is here on The Caring Generation and PamelaDWilson.com.
And welcome back. So, what is commodification? What does that mean? Well, it stands to reason just about everything that we need is commodified nowadays. We need food, and there's ways to get food. We need transportation, there's ways to get that. So, to talk a little bit more about the commodification of sex and touch, Dr. Murphy, can you explain a little bit about how that applies here?
Yeah, so one of the things I think it's important to clarify is what commodification is, in fact. And as you mentioned, it really is the process that occurs when anything is turned into a commercial product. So whether it's grain or oil or steel or any other material or even social service, we can say that uh, many other things are, in fact, commodified because they're turned into a saleable product. So
Yeah.
anything that is
So
turned
they
into a
made it
saleable
available.
product is a commodity, anything
Mhm.
that's made available on a market. And so one of the things that has happened, as we've seen in the media in recent decades, is that intimacy, or the process that we might call sex, the human contact between human beings, is something that forms the core of a lot of what we consume every day on the media. You think of movies, I mean, there's always um, usually a sexual theme at the center of the the entertainment process, and that means that our our energy and our attention is drawn by this dynamic, powerful thing that is what we call sex, in terms of the impulse that we and the drive that we have toward human contact. And so, and that actually allows us to garner people's attention, get them to focus on the material that we want to focus on, and then media uses that attention in order to sell products. And that is the process of commodification, of intimacy, of human touch. And we see that all the time in almost every form of entertainment that we encounter. So, this process of commodification is related to the issue of objectification, which I think it's good to talk about as well. And certainly, as we've talked about, the women's liberation movement was largely about the effort to, on the part of women, to not be objectified as sexual objects, if you will, objects of sexual desire and interest, and objectified in that way, and to become liberated from that focus of energy, which really constrained their freedom, their
Yeah.
opportunity to be the kind of person they want to be, not to have to meet the requirements of that form of objectification, which is part of the commodification process. So I think that those really are the underpinnings of a huge amount of the economy of the United States and throughout the world. If you think about our media, I think the research shows that a very high percentage, 75, 85, 90% of the material on um, our computers these days relates to the issue of sex, either directly or indirectly, intimacy, pornography. All of those markets are things that really are very predominant in our forms of communication now. So we really need to make conscious decisions about how we want to manage that process, how we want to manage the commodification of intimacy, this process of taking the touching phenomenon, this requirement that we have to be touched, and it has been turned into a saleable product, is really a complex and important issue.
So, would you say that when we talk about the power of sex, it takes us to a word that is used quite a bit? And according to Audre Lorde, she says that when something becomes erotic, it becomes powerful. And when we use the term erotic, as far as the commercialization value that it has, um, it it expands beyond the confines of just mere sexual gratification. It actually just actually said that it becomes a profound source of energy. So when you talk about something as powerful as sex and touch, as energy, self knowledge, and transformative power, it becomes even more of a commodity. And so now we see in social media and everywhere, as you mentioned before, Dr. Murphy, that is being marketed as something that is powerful. When you take a look at history, um, many world changing events have uh, been altered with this kind of power that we're talking about. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly, I think that, if you look over human history, go all the way back to Helen of Troy, in Homer's great book, um, the source of energy and the causes of conflict have been, very significantly organized around these issues. I mean, it involves the perpetuation of the human race, the choices that we make, and our fundamental energy is organized around survival more than anything else. So it's not surprising that these issues around the skin and intimacy and touching really determine uh, the quality of our lives and the quality of our relationships every day. And yet we don't spend a lot of time negotiating them and talking about them and engaging in the conversation that we need to have in order to sort of clarify this. I oftentimes work with clients who are dealing with these issues of intimacy with each other and suggest they engage in something that I call meta communication. That is, they approach the other person, maybe a spouse or a lover or a partner or a friend, and they say, and you ask them, how can we best have some communication about this issue of closeness? So how can I best talk with you about your need for closeness and our need to share closeness? How can we
Right.
structuralize that conversation? So talking about how to have the conversation before you actually engage in statements about the issue of intimacy. And I think that shows respect for for the person and indicates that you're not trying to control them or dominate them or have it be um, managed in the way that you specifically want it to be managed, but rather shows your openness to also meeting the needs of the other person. I want to hear how you want to deal with this issue, what your thoughts and feelings are about this. Tell me how I can best be supportive of you in dealing with this issue with you. So I think our openness as a society and with regard to our individual relationships these days is just a huge transition for us as human beings. As you say, in the past, it was very much a dichotomous thing. It really was constrained by social mores and rules. And now we're starting to open all that up and start to talk about the potential variations. But that requires that we have these conversations, these open conversations about the nature of sexual identity, our needs to be touched,
Right.
how we want to be touched, how frequently, when, by whom, and what our thoughts and feelings are. So I think it really is an opportunity for us to engage in a new form of communication around the issue of touch that I think has the potential to have a hugely positive effect on human society around the world. What do we really need? I mean, we need to be touched. We need to be loved. We need to be cared for. And the more that we can do that, I think, the less we will need to be engaged in conflict and war and strife and greed and all the negative sorts of emotions and impulses that cause such
Ideally,
problems
yeah.
to, yeah,
You know,
society.
the power behind and the energy behind what Audra calls erotic power is quite different from what is being marketed today. Audra differentiates the difference between erotic power versus that which is pornographic. And she says that while erotic is about the depth of feeling, the pornographic is a direct denial of the power of the erotic. So what that does, it reduces passion to sensation without meaning, without any general connection, while the erotic, in contrast, nature nurtures the authenticity and the wholeness and the tremendous power and energy that that kind of intimacy has. So I'd like to know from you, you mentioned uh, having a new communication, a new form of communication uh, regarding this. How would that communication look? I mean, I know that we communicate without words very, very effectively. Um, so to include nuance, to include body language, to include even decision making and attitude, how would we incorporate all of those things into the new form of communication that you're talking about?
That's a great and very complex question. And I think that one of the things that you raise up is that the language of the skin and the language of touch is essentially a nonverbal form of communication.
It
So
is.
we need to rely almost exclusively for our communication on words and on ways that we communicate things literally through language, verbal language. And yet, the language of touch is a fundamental and critical form of communication that we rarely talk about or manage consciously. And so it's not surprising that sometimes it gets very, very problematic. And then we get into the areas of what we call sexual trauma. And when people feel like the touch boundary, the opportunity to protect themselves and ensure their safety is violated in a way that is against their will or against their consent, and is not a form of experience that is congruent with their needs and choices, that is something that contributes to the emergence of what we call sexual trauma. And sexual trauma is a huge issue that really affects a lot of people and has
Yeah,
to do with the issue of disempowerment,
for
feeling
sure.
like you have sexual needs and desires, and yet they are mishandled by another person in a way that subjects you to sexual suffering, if you will,
Yeah.
and that results in consequences for the person.
Um, and that's a really deep issue that we'll talk more about when we come back. I want to also talk about whose responsibility is it to communicate these boundaries? Is it people we're talking to, or is it us who need to establish our boundaries, or is it both? When we come back, don't go away.
Master of words, powerful player. What life-changing words can Dr. Janet Smith Warfield pull out of her magical toolbox that just might mysteriously open a door you never knew was there? A door to free yourself from fear forever. Transform your rage into right action. Release your guilt. Position you into a life of freedom, purpose, passion, power, and peace. All quite suddenly, unexpectedly, and almost miraculously, with no effort on your part. Join Dr. Janet on Dancing with Words, Dancing with Wisdom, as she and her guests show you how words map our experiences, immersing you in a sound bath that relaxes your muscles, opens your mind, and supports you in co-creating your extraordinary life. Author, radio show host, and coach John M. Hawkins reveals strategies to help gain perspective, build confidence, find clarity, achieve goals. John M. Hawkins' new book, Coached to Greatness, Unlock Your Full Potential with Limitless Growth, published by iUniverse. Hawkins reveals strategies to help readers accomplish more. He believes the book can coach them to greatness. Hawkins says that the best athletes get to the top of their sport with the help of coaches, mentors, and others. He shares guidance that helps readers reflect on what motivates them, rediscover and assess their core values, philosophies, and competencies, find settings that allow them to be the most productive, and track their progress towards accomplishing goals.
And welcome back. We're talking about boundaries and communication. And, it's important to understand that, as everyday citizens, we learn to respect each other's boundaries and to anticipate when we're encroaching a little bit on somebody's boundaries. It's also important for us to establish boundaries so that others don't have to worry about crossing our boundaries. But what about where there is a deficit of boundary space? What if some people just, simply don't know where other people's boundaries are, or what they don't feel comfortable with the boundaries that are socially set for us? To talk more about that, Dr. Murphy, can you shed a little bit of light on that?
That's really a very kind of contemporary and relevant issue that we've encountered more and more. One of the things that's happened now is that we have a disorder which we call autism that we've seen increase remarkably in our society. There's been much higher rates of what we call autism. And one of the reasons that has occurred is that we've changed the diagnostic categories with regard to what it is. And autism is essentially a disorder of nonverbal communication, oftentimes. So, nonverbal communication has to do with touch. So, these issues of intimacy and touching and the cognitive abilities to understand the meaning of touching is something that can be affected by uh, cognitive deficits, just like, for example, a verbal learning problem like dyslexia, somebody has a reading problem or something like that, you also can suffer deficits in the area of the processing of nonverbal communication, which has to do with the meaning of touch and the meaning of all forms of nonverbal conduct with regard to another person. So that's a very complex issue that really is something that we need to address and be aware of. Um, it's called now it's called the spectrum disorder, autism spectrum disorder, in that we all live somewhere on that continuum of nonverbal fluency, if you will. Some people are very socially aware and sensitive with regard to the meaning of nonverbal communication. Some people are much less skilled in that area. And we all know that. We've all maybe had family members or ourselves,
Right.
when we either have good skills for nonverbal communication. What does a look mean? What does a gesture mean? What does a certain manner of touch mean? And if a
Yeah.
person suffers from autism, they suffer deficits in that area, and that has implications, tremendous implications for the quality of their relationships.
You know,
And so all of us are on those spectrums somewhere. We need to sort of accept that and be
yeah,
willing to discuss.
definitely. The only 7% of our communication is verbal. 93% is nonverbal. So when we think about that, it kind of makes us wonder, how effective is my communication, all of my nonverbal communication? And they say the effectiveness of your communication is the results that you get. So in other words, why are we surprised when people don't respond to our communication? It's because we haven't communicated effectively. Body
That's
language
a great
or
point. And I think that, one of the things that we can do, if we want to improve our levels of communication and success in the world, because so much of communication is in fact nonverbal and has to do perhaps with touch or other forms of nonverbal communication, is to focus more consciously on how we are communicating nonverbally, how we stand, how we use our hands, how we look at people, our tone of voice. It's called prosody. How someone speaks loudly or harshly, or they speak more softly.
so
That's called
communication
prosody. Yeah,
communication accounts for not just what we're putting out, but for what we're taking in. In other words, listening. How often do we listen versus how often are we saying something? When we're listening, we're also looking at cues, physical cues, nuanced cues that tell us whether or not the person is engaged with us or not. And when we get a cue that says, well, I've lost their attention, that shows us that we've lost their attention, it's time to uh, revert to another form of communication, which is the listening part, the taking in. I know with people that are on the spectrum, I work with several people on the spectrum that know they're on their spectrum, and they at, at some point will comment on the fact that they're not good with this kind of communication or that communication or at this particular skill, communication skill, or that one. And I think that's admirable, for all of us to realize, where do we fit, when it comes to communication. Are we talkers? Are we listeners? Are we both? Are we balanced? Because and how well do we read our listeners? It would be wonderful if we could see our audience as we're talking now, to see how many people are actually still engaged with us and how many are not. What do you have to say about that, Dr. Murphy?
that's a great point, because in these forms of communication, whether it's on your phone or on your computer, we oftentimes don't have, the opportunity to really see in great
Texting,
detail how
texting
how
to the
how,
example.
how other people are responding to us nonverbally. And in fact, a large percentage of the brain, the human brain, is devoted to subtle perceptions of changes in the musculature of the face of the other person. I mean, which starts in early infancy when an infant is looking at his or her mother and is looking at the face, and that face really determines, the quality of life that that infant is going to have. So it's very important, and they're constantly checking out with great subtlety, exactly what the nonverbal communication is of that face of that human being who's most important to them, and that is their mother. So a huge amount of our brain is devoted to that, and that continues onto adulthood. So when we look at another person, and we are constantly processing whether we feel they're seeing us and receiving us or not. And we need to know that that's happening so we can try to be attentive to the other person and really give them the sense that we are looking at their signals, their nonverbal signals, that we're trying to read their nonverbal signals accurately. paying attention to the nonverbal signals and language of the other person is critical to the quality of the relationship. Not just words, but also really watching how they hold their body, how they move their hands, their facial expression, all of that, and being attentive to it and responding accurately to its meaning is really going to improve the quality of our relationships hugely.
So how would you say this connects to the idea of reclaiming the erotic? I think there what is called the erotic sometimes will have a negative connotation or an immoral connotation in some people's minds, but it's a very powerful subject. Where individuals need to understand that it's not just about personal pleasure, but a collective strength that we need in the form of communication. Where we actually look into someone's eyes and we regard their expressions, we regard their nonverbal communication as very powerful, very significant, uh, you know, forms of communication. That need to be addressed in context, and then that need to be met at the same level. I think that's what turns sensuality into a catalyst for change when you really think about how we engage with each other, how we use intimacy to express ourselves and to bring ourselves to a mutual closeness, if you will.
That's a deep insight, Coach Mike, I think, really, because we all have experiences with people, with particular people in particular relationships in which we really feel comfortable. And why is that the case? Well, somehow they're communicating to us an attention to um, our being, and they are showing that they're aware and they're accurately responding to the signals, the nonverbal signals that we are sending to them. So the nonverbal communication is really working. They may be leaning toward us, we may be leaning toward them. They may put out a hand, they may uh, look at us in a certain part of our body. All these nonverbal signals have a huge amount of meaning, and they contribute to a sense of safety. When you're with a person who you feel is tuned in to your nonverbal signals, you feel safe. And that is, that perpetuates itself throughout society and creates a whole environment of peace. That's why you see in, monastic environments and places like that that really focus on these issues very explicitly, that they have a whole form of nonverbal communication that is emphasizing the sense of safety and security and the ability to remain calm and to feel like you're in a pleasant place where you're able to simply be centered in yourself. Meditation is essentially a form of nonverbal communication with yourself and with your internal environment, and sharing that experience with other people really increases the sense of safety that everyone is experiencing. So I think it's just really, really a critical issue that we're bringing up here in terms of, our concern for the quality of our nonverbal communication and really paying attention to it, paying attention to others' nonverbal signals and the ones that we communicate to others in the course of it, with the purpose, the goal ultimately of improving the quality of the relationship.
Casey Basili brought up um, the concept of the resource desert for sexual health. He uses that to describe environments where uh, people just have a hard time or limited access to resources that are related to sexual well-being. And I think this scarcity is something that needs to be addressed just along with a lot of the other things that we're talking about. But when our communication, our nonverbal cues in the context of intimacy and closeness are misinterpreted, there is a liability and an opportunity for them to be criminalized. And this is something I think that maybe we can talk in the next segment as soon as we come back. But don't go away. We'll talk a little bit about the resource desert when it comes to sexual health. Thanks for being with us. See you in a minute.
Are you struggling to care for elderly parents or a spouse? Do you wonder if being a caregiver is making you sick? Are you worried about taking time off work to care for elderly parents and balance work, life, and caregiving? Has caregiving become exhausting and emotionally draining? Are you an aging adult who wants to remain independent but you're not sure how? I'm Pamela D. Wilson. Join me for the Caring Generation radio show for caregivers and aging adults, Wednesday evenings, 6 Pacific, 7 Mountain, 8 Central, and 9 Eastern, where I answer these questions and share tips for managing stress, family relationships, health, well-being, and more. Podcasts and transcripts of The Caring Generation are on my website, PamelaDWilson.com, plus my caregiving library, online caregiver support programs, and programs for corporations interested in supporting working caregivers. Help, hope, and support for caregivers is here on The Caring Generation and PamelaDWilson.com.
Master of words, powerful player. What life-changing words can Dr. Janet Smith Warfield pull out of her magical toolbox that just might mysteriously open a door you never knew was there? A door to free yourself from fear forever. Transform your rage into right action. Release your guilt. Position you into a life of freedom, purpose, passion, power, and peace. All quite suddenly, unexpectedly, and almost miraculously, with no effort on your part. Join Dr. Janet on Dancing with Words, Dancing with Wisdom, as she and her guests show you how words map our experiences, immersing you in a sound bath that relaxes your muscles, opens your mind, and supports you in co-creating your extraordinary life.
Welcome back, Dr. Michael Murphy and me, Coach Mike Corral. We're talking about the resource desert. Resource desert leaves people with few safe options for receiving care, education, or even healing related to sexuality and touch. The result is isolation, unmet needs, and sometimes greater psychological, even physical harm, if you will. Basili's resource desert refers to the widespread lack of supportive, accessible, and affirming resources for sexual health, especially in environments where the law and sometimes social norms act as boundaries rather than bridges for well being. What do you have to say about that, Dr. Murphy?
Well, certainly, almost every state in the United States has a facility that is specifically devoted to incarcerating individuals who have engaged in violations of the sexual boundary, if you will. They've engaged in what we call sexual assault, whether it's rape, indecent sexual assault, or some other offense that has a legal consequence, results in a sentence, and they can be held at a facility that specifically addresses and contains and even offers treatment for individuals who have a propensity to engage in sexual offending. And so I have been on the staff of those institutions and completed many, many hundreds of evaluations in that setting. And so I have some specific awareness of how that happens. But over and over again, it does certainly reflect what we were talking about before. That is the inability to understand and respect the boundaries of other people with regard to the issue of touch and closeness. And, this has to do with the issue of power and really understanding that other people have the right to set appropriate boundaries with regard to touch or contact, intimacy, and when an individual violates those boundaries with regard to touch or intimacy and engages in contact against the victim's will, that is in fact a criminal offense that results in harm and probably trauma to the victim, and therefore, results in a situation where that individual may have a propensity to engage in such offenses,
Yeah.
needs treatment, very specific forms of treatment to help them to understand the meaning of those behaviors that they engaged in, how they harmed other people, how they can avoid um, engaging in those kinds of aberrant behaviors in the future. That's called sex offender treatment. And there are programs for those kinds of aberrant behaviors in most states around the country. And you can have that treatment in the community as well. So it really is a very big issue. And it's something that, has a lot of consequences, unfortunately for victims who
Yeah.
are subjected to that kind of trauma.
Would you say that the criminalization of sex work, for example, touch-based therapies like massage therapy for healing and intimacy, sometimes those I mean, even some forms of consensual behavior, they create a legal landscape that I don't know prioritizes the control and the risk management more than the power of healing that they have. You know, I mean, people who seek those things for health uh, are not getting the support that they need. For example, if they need it for after to recover from some kind of trauma or a positive sexual orientation or even safe legal touch, you know, they often confront a system that is more focused on regulation and restriction than on providing care. Right?
It's a great question. I mean, I think when you think about it, even though we have a need for touch, just as we have a need for touch for food, we have a need for water, we have a need for activity, you can't go up to some kind of facility and order up, um, you know,
Te- 10 minutes of touch.
fulfilling and compassionate and loving touch like you would a hamburger or something like that. So we haven't really created very clear kind of modes of acquisition with regard to fulfilling our need for loving touch, even though it's just as fundamental a requirement as food or musical stimulation or exercise,
Right.
things like that. We have clubs that attend to our need to lift weights. Right. We have clubs that attend to our need for exercise all over the country by the thousands, yet we hardly have even addressed, the subtlety and complexity of this need for human contact and warmth that is just as urgent and just as
Right.
important to our health.
We got less than 2 minutes left, but I want to tell you, I want to give you the opportunity to read that poem, Dr. Murphy, and it might take us over the 2 minute mark. But if you will, go right into that poem.
So I'd like to read this poem. This is a poem by a woman who's called Donna Swanson. She's a poet. Many years ago, wrote this book called Minnie Remembers, or this poem called Minnie Remembers. It's a beautiful poem about the
Less
need for touch. Excuse me?
1 minute left. Go.
Okay, God, my hands are old. I've never said that out loud before, but they are. I was so proud of them once. They were soft, like the velvet smoothness of a firm, ripe peach. Now the softness is more like worn out sheets or weathered leaves. When did these slender, graceful hands become gnarled, shrunken claws? When, God? They lie here in my lap, naked reminders of this worn out body that have served me too well. How long has it been since someone touched me? 20 years? 20 years I've been a widow, respected, smiled at, but never touched, never held so close that loneliness was blotted out. I remember how my mother used to hold me. God, when I was hurt in spirit or flesh, she would gather me close and stroke my silky hair and caress my back with her warm hands. Oh God, I'm so lonely. I remember the first boy who ever kissed me. We were both so new at that. The taste of young lips and popcorn, the feeling of hands inside and mysteries to come. I remember Hank and the babies.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy.
Thank you very much. It's a beautiful poem. I urge you to read it.
Ran out of time here, but remember to subscribe, follow and subscribe, like and subscribe. Come back to see us some more. We're going to have a series on this topic, sex in touch. So come back next week and we'll talk a little bit about that some more.
Great talking to you, Coach Mike.
Likewise, Dr. Murphy. Take care.
This has been Snippets of Wisdom with hosts Mike Carell and Dr. Michael J. Murphy. Tune in and learn about the primary issues facing our society today and find the best chance of securing a stable and prosperous future. Snippets of Wisdom will enrich your life and the lives of all of your loved ones.